So our next speaker is JD Knotts, who is also a postdoc at UCLA within the same lab of Dr. Grasky. And he will talk about lack of latent structure across levels of measurement of positive and negative valence processing in mood and anxiety disorders. And beside research, JD also studies like visual perception and consciousness in Hokan Lau lab, and he'd be happy to discuss this even more during the Q&A session. So, but go ahead, JD. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess a non-research fact, I also play Dungeons and Dragons with Yueqi.
Nice. You guys have a Dungeons and Dragons like a team in the lab?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. Happy to be presenting in the session. And today I'm going to talk about a collaborative study between UCLA and UCSD that takes an RDOC-based approach towards understanding anxiety and depression. Let's see my screen. There we go. So for a quick overview of what the Research Domain Criteria or RDOC Initiative is, this is an NIMH initiative to develop a research framework that explores these sort of core domains or dimensions of mental disorders, and specifically tries to look at them across different units of measurement or levels of analysis. And the goal is that if you can identify these latent constructs across these different levels of measurement, then the resulting sort of dimensional picture that you get of mental disorders should be better equipped to handle things like heterogeneity or comorbidity of symptoms than sort of standard symptom-based diagnostic procedures, which can suffer from things like misdiagnosis based on some arbitrary cutoffs. So if someone's just under a symptom cutoff, you may misdiagnose them. So specifically, we want to look at the RDOC constructs underlying anxiety and depression. So we are going to look specifically at the negative and positive valence systems. And we are looking across these 4 levels of analysis. So neural circuits, physiology, behavior, and self-report. And a basic overview of our study is that we gave participants a battery of a bunch of different tasks so that we can extract a bunch of observed variables from these tasks over different levels of measurement. So we get symptom measures, behavioral measures, physio and neural measures. And then we'll submit them to a factor analysis, sort of like what Yueqi presented with that tri-level model in her presentation. And the idea is that through this analysis, we can extract latent variables that should correspond to these RDOC constructs of positive and negative valence. And of most interest is finding latent factors that span levels of measurement. So we used a bunch of tasks, which I'll try to go through quickly, so these figures may look familiar. We used the same fear conditioning paradigm as in the brain map study, except with the exception that we didn't have people come back to do the extinction retention the next day. But here, to recap, we are pairing shock with the color of a light and doing that during the acquisition phase. And then there's an extinction phase where the CS+, the color that was paired with shock, is no longer paired. And we looked at fMRI measures of this. So we had people do this task in the scanner. We also collected galvanic skin response while they were doing this. We collected contingency ratings about how much they thought that the CS+ was related to shock. And we also got valence and arousal ratings. So all of these, so this particular task, fear conditioning, allows us to look across all 4 units of measurement. And this is specifically trying to target the acute threat subconstruct of the negative valence system. And we looked at some traditional prefrontal and subcortical structures in our fMRI analysis. So then the next task we used was this monetary incentive delay task, which briefly, Subjects get a cue, which either tells them that they can potentially get a reward or a loss on a given trial. And there's this little anticipation interval while they wait for this target to pop up. And then they have a speeded response task. And if they click a button fast enough, they can either get the reward or avoid the loss. So this is specifically supposed to target the loss and reward responsiveness constructs. And we did this with FMRI, so we're only looking at the circuit level of measurement here. Third task is this IAPS task, which is we just show participants an array of images, which can either have a positive, negative, or a neutral connotation, and then we have them give us a valence and arousal rating. And here, we collected galvanic skin response and heart rate while people perform this task. So we're looking at the physiological unit of measurement and also self-report with their valence and arousal ratings. And here we're targeting the acute threat subconstruct of the negative valence system and reward responsiveness of the positive valence system. And then the fourth behavioral task that we have is this mirror tracing persistence task, which is just this really annoying task where you have to trace a star in a mirror. And every time you make a mistake, there's this loud noise. And we basically see how long people will last. They can opt out at any point. So as a behavioral measure here, we take the task duration, how long people last. And we also collected heart rate while they perform this. So here we're looking at physiology and behavior of the frustrated non-reward construct of the negative valence system. And then finally, we gave a large array of self-report questionnaires to target threat, loss, reward responsiveness, and reward valuation. So those are the tasks that we used. We collected data from 225 participants across UCLA and UCSD. And some important inclusion criteria were that they had to score at least 10 or higher on the PHQ-9, which is supposed to measure depression symptoms, and 8 or above on the OASIS, or overall anxiety and impairment scale, which measures anxiety. And so this was supposed to give us a sample that had a range of clinically relevant anxiety and depression symptoms that wouldn't necessarily have people categorized or diagnosed with depressive disorder or generalized anxiety. And then once we collect all of that data, we're going to use group factor analysis, which is a Bayesian factor analysis approach, where you pre-specify the different groups that your data are in, and it decomposes them into a set of latent variables, each of which has its own set of factor loadings. And the group factor analysis approach uses a sparse prior, which ensures that all resulting factors either explain the relationships between groups. So this could be relationships between all of the groups or a subset of the groups, or it explains only the variance within a specific group. So the sparse part means that for explaining a subset of groups, the relationship between a subset of groups, any group that's not in that relationship, all factor loadings are set to 0. And the same thing with these noise factors. If it's explaining just the variance within a single group, then all other group factor loadings are set to 0. So in our case, we're using different tasks and different levels of measure as our different groups. And the idea is that if we find these RDOC relevant factors, those will be the factors that extend across groups, that explain the relationships between these different groups. So this is a heat map showing our results. And you can see on the y-axis here, we have 11 latent factors that were identified. And across the top here, this shows the different groups, which are divided by these thick black lines. And the colored rectangles show the individual factor loadings within each group for each factor. And this was looking at 118 participants in our data set who had complete data across a majority of the tasks. And the take home here is that if you look at each of these factors, none of them have factor loadings that extend across more than one group. So each factor's non-zero factor loadings are relegated to just a single group. So this basically means that we've failed to find this stable, any stable latent constructs that extend across levels of measurement, which is sort of the goal from the RDOC perspective. And to allay concerns that this was just like a sample size issue, we looked in different subsets of the data where we had larger sample sizes, looking at across a smaller number of groups, but continually we found that every latent factor we could extract was relegated to one group. So some conclusions about this. This result supports a lot of findings in the literature that have looked for relationships between self-report measures and behavior. So this has been observed in self-control, self-regulation, impulsivity, and cognitive empathy, where we just don't find a lot of correlational structure between these two groups of measures. And so this highlights some challenges for the RDOC approach. So one challenge is that certain latent factors that you extract when you do an approach like this, they may end up reflecting some task-specific features that aren't necessarily related to the construct you're trying to probe. So this is based on some post-hoc analysis that I'd be happy to talk about, where we found that, for example, the MID task factors, they don't necessarily reflect the difference between reward and loss, but they actually seem to reflect the difference between anticipation and consumption. So that speaks to designing your tasks to try to target very specifically the constructs you're interested in. And then there's also this idea that different subconstructs that you might be interested in within a domain may just function relatively independently, and you may not be able to find a lot of correlation between them, which is evidenced by us not finding factors that loaded across tasks. And then it also may be the case that state effects affect your measurements and can obscure your ability to get at these target constructs. So if someone's having a particularly good or bad day, that can obscure measurement. And so that should be, tasks should be optimized to avoid that in the future. So moving forward, these data don't necessarily say that the RDOC approach is doomed. We've also done some post hoc analyses that have shown that there are weak relationships between latent factors extracted from within task GFAs. So there's probably something there. We just need to make sure that we've got enough power and that we've developed our tasks well to try to find these relationships in the data. So I'd like to end by thanking my collaborators, especially Yueqi, who's in the session, and Michelle Krask and Martin Paulus, who are the PIs who've been the main overseers of these analyses. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, JD. Great work. Wow, amazing amount of data you have collected, like all these tasks that people had to do. It's impressive. I mean, and
yeah, that's a lot.
Can you can work on this for the next 20 years on this.
Yeah, it's a lot to work with for sure.
Yeah. So of course, like feel free to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom here, and please do ask questions. But yeah, I was wondering, like, if you are planning also to do some analysis using structural MRIs, or whether, because I guess you collected it anyway, right? Because
yeah, you know, we haven't discussed that really. We've been so focused on just the fMRI contrast that we've used in this analysis. But yeah, I mean, especially you know, based on the other talks we've had in this session, I think that there could be some really interesting stuff with volumetric data. I don't think that we have connectivity data in this data set, right, Yueqi? I don't. I'm pretty sure we don't. But
by connectivity, do you mean like DTI data?
Yeah.
No, we don't.
Okay. Yeah, but we I think looking at volumetric structural differences could be really informative. But we haven't looked yet.
You could look into functional connectivity, right? Because you have your
yeah, definitely. And and we're doing some of that actually with the latent factors that we've extracted from the GFA. So there's some questionnaires that we held out of this analysis, like early adversity, And we're doing some follow-up analyses trying to see if like latent factors derived from fMRI during fear conditioning can predict like childhood trauma. And there's some kind of interesting results there so far. But there's, yeah, I mean, there's so many things you can look at with this.
Yeah, it would be interesting to also take, you know, if and when you guys get around to looking at the childhood adversity factors and like look and see what you find with structural and see if there's anything interesting between those two things as well.
Yeah, definitely.
We did a similar study out of this lab looking at like some volumetric aspects and met with measures of like childhood adversity and also like kind of like longitudinal adversity throughout the lifetime when we measured adults.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's definitely something to do in the future.
It's exciting to see how the first slide that you showed, the image was a great kind of overview of what you guys are doing with this data and some of the different things you're looking at.
This one?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, so this is straight from the NIMH website.
Yeah.
This is their kind of their official graphic
But
for this.
it
So
really
yeah, I mean,
illustrates what you guys are up to.
yeah, and I mean we're only looking at the negative and positive valence systems. There's a lot. There's other domains to explore, and a lot of work being done on this. Yeah, it seems like an interesting and important thing to parse for improving diagnoses and treatments.
Well, just this demonstrates how nothing is happening in a vacuum. You know, it never has been, but like we're really starting to see that more. I feel like in the past, you know, even 5 years, and you're seeing that reflected in like the research. It's you have to look at all the different pieces of things together.
Yeah, exactly. That's like, you know, the issue about comorbidity is if you consider all of these different disorders in isolation from each other, you might end up diagnosing someone with one thing, even though they've got, you know, total overlap or like really strong overlap with symptoms for another disorder, and that might just get completely ignored, and you might be missing a whole dimension of their disorder that could otherwise be treated. Or
yeah, and then it gets into like individual differences too, because like if you just look at things individually, then you're not really seeing how it's working for that individual.
Yeah,
unfortunately we have to wrap up, but guys, thank you very much for
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting